Welcome back to our channel. This is Laughing Headlines. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for addressing long-standing injustices against Africa, emphasizing the need for the continent to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Speaking at the China-Africa Forum, where over 50 African leaders were present, Guterres highlighted the economic struggles many African countries face, including heavy debt burdens and limited access to sustainable development funding. He noted that China's development successes, particularly in poverty eradication, could serve as a model for Africa to harness its potential in trade technology and other key areas. Today, guess who we have as our very special guest on the show? The United Nations Secretary General himself, Mr. Antonio Guterres. We'll be discussing Africa's role in global governance, the challenges of economic development, and what can be done to address the growing debt crisis facing many African nations. Stay tuned as we explore solutions and insights on how Africa can unlock its full potential on the world stage. Mr. Guterres, thank you for joining us today. In your recent address to African leaders at the China-Africa Forum, you spoke about the historic injustices against Africa, particularly with regard to the continent's exclusion from a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Can you elaborate on why you believe this reform is so critical now?
Thank you for having me. The exclusion of Africa from the permanent seats of the Security Council is an issue of global fairness and representation. Africa is home to some of the world's fastest-growing economies, rich cultures, and substantial political influence. Yet, it remains without a voice in one of the most powerful decision-making bodies in global governance. Given Africa's role in international peace, security, and development, it is long overdue that the continent be represented permanently on the Security Council.
Okay,
Africa's
interesting.
economic
You have mentioned
struggles,
China's role in development, especially with its success in eradicating poverty. How do you see China's involvement in Africa's growth moving
Security
forward?
Council.
So let me
Africa's
ask you this.
economic struggles are deeply concerning. Many nations are burdened by unsustainable debt and have limited access to proper relief. The international community needs to step up, providing effective debt restructuring solutions and adequate funding. This includes greater support for African-led initiatives and ensuring that financial systems are not disproportionately disadvantageous to African economies. There is a need to create an environment where African countries can thrive on their own terms. China's development model, especially in poverty reduction, can serve as an important example for Africa. The collaboration between China and Africa, particularly through technology, trade, and digital infrastructure, has the potential to be transformative. China has the resources and expertise to help African nations build resilient economies. However, this partnership must prioritize the long-term benefits for African nations and ensure that it leads to sustainable development rather than creating new dependencies.
Forward.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you this. Do you believe Africa is ready to maximize this potential? In your opinion?
Absolutely. Africa is full of untapped potential, from its youthful population to its growing digital innovation hubs. With the right investments, fair trade practices, and proper governance, Africa can not only meet its challenges, but also become a leader in various global sectors. What's needed now is a concerted effort from the international community to support Africa's aspirations while empowering it to take control of its own destiny.
In your opinion, up till now, why doesn't Africa have a representative at the UN Security Council?
The lack of a permanent African representative on the UN Security Council stems from historical and structural inequalities that have persisted since the creation of the United Nations. When the UN was founded in 1945, the Security Council's structure reflected the power dynamics of that era, which favored the victors of World War II. Africa at the time was largely under colonial rule, and its voice was marginalized in global decision-making processes. This outdated structure has been slow to change due to geopolitical interests and resistance from some of the existing permanent members of the Security Council, who are reluctant to share power. Despite the continent's significant economic, political, and demographic growth, reforms have not yet been implemented to reflect the changing global landscape. Guterres believes this is a deep injustice that must be corrected to ensure fairness and inclusivity in international governance.
Viewers, the conversation is getting more and more interesting. And our guest today is Mr. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General. Do you think Africa has well positioned itself for such opportunities?
Africa has made significant strides in positioning itself for greater global opportunities, but there is still much work to be done. The continent has immense potential, with its young and dynamic population, growing economies, and increasing innovation in sectors like technology, agriculture, and renewable energy. However, the challenges of governance, infrastructure, and regional cooperation sometimes hinder the continent from fully capitalizing on these opportunities. That said, I believe Africa is on the right path. Many African countries are embracing reform, investing in education, and working towards regional integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, for example, is a huge step toward creating a unified market, which will enhance Africa's bargaining power on the global stage. So, while there are obstacles to overcome, Africa is increasingly positioning itself to take advantage of international opportunities, and the global community must support these efforts. Africa's rightful place at the decision-making table is not just about readiness, it's about fairness. Africa has earned it, and the time for the world to recognize that is now.
Why does it seem it is only Africa that is reeling under debts? How does the Western world manage to develop and Africa can't do the same?
Point 7. The issue of debt in Africa is complex. And while it is true that many African nations struggle under heavy debt burdens, it's not the only region facing financial challenges. However, Africa is disproportionately affected due to a combination of historical, structural, and economic factors that have made it more vulnerable. One key reason is the legacy of colonialism, which left many African nations with fragile economies and weak institutions at the time of independence. This has contributed to a reliance on external borrowing to fund development projects and infrastructure. Additionally, global financial systems are often structured in ways that disadvantage developing economies, making it difficult for African countries to access affordable loans or receive favorable terms. The Western world, in contrast, has more established financial systems, stronger institutions, and greater access to global markets and investment. They also have more diversified economies that are better able to absorb financial shocks. Many Western countries benefit from historically accumulated wealth and stronger credit ratings, allowing them to borrow at lower interest rates and with more favorable conditions. Another factor is the difference in how debt is managed. Many Western nations have the capacity to issue bonds in their own currencies, while African countries often borrow in foreign currencies, making them more vulnerable to currency fluctuations and global market changes. This puts African economies at greater risk when there are economic downturns or shifts in commodity prices, which many African countries heavily rely on for revenue. However, it's important to note that Africa is not without solutions. Many African countries are working to diversify their economies, strengthen governance, and invest in long-term infrastructure to reduce dependency on debt. But the global financial system also needs to change to ensure that African nations have fair access to resources and opportunities. Collaborative international efforts, such as debt relief and restructuring, are essential to break this cycle and allow Africa to thrive on a more level playing field.
Can we say the Western world has a hand in the underdevelopment of Africa? Can we say the Western world doesn't wish for Africa to develop?
Point 8. It's a sensitive and complex issue to suggest that the Western world deliberately doesn't wish for Africa to develop. Historically, there have been instances where policies and actions by Western nations, particularly during the colonial era and in the post-colonial period, have contributed to Africa's underdevelopment. These include exploitation of resources, unfair trade practices, and political interference that weaken governance structures in African countries. In some cases, Western interests have prioritized maintaining control over Africa's resources, markets, and political landscape, which may have indirectly hampered Africa's development. However, it's important to acknowledge that many Western countries and institutions also contribute to development efforts in Africa through aid, trade agreements, investments, and collaborations. But critics argue that some of these efforts can create dependencies, focusing more on short-term relief than on empowering African nations to build sustainable, self-reliant economies. There is also the global economic system to consider. Many believe that the structure of international trade, finance, and debt often disproportionately favors wealthier nations, making it harder for African countries to thrive. For example, African nations often export raw materials and import finished goods at higher costs, leading to trade imbalances and a reliance on foreign markets. So, while it might not be accurate to say that the Western world as a whole doesn't wish for Africa to develop, certain practices, both historical and contemporary, have certainly contributed to Africa's development challenges. The question moving forward is how global systems can be reformed to ensure a fairer playing field, where African countries can fully realize their potential without external hindrances. This requires both Western countries and African leaders to work together toward mutual goals of progress and prosperity,
So, would
Corruption.
you say African leaders are too corrupt and are only interested in stealing their various countries' wealth, and that's what is increasing the continent debts?
Corruption is certainly a serious issue in many parts of the world, including Africa, and it can be a significant factor contributing to the economic challenges faced by some countries. When public resources are mismanaged or stolen, it undermines development efforts, weakens institutions, and increases poverty. Corruption can also exacerbate debt problems, as funds meant for infrastructure, education, and healthcare are diverted for personal gain, leading to inefficient borrowing and unsustainable financial practices. However, it's important to note that corruption is not unique to Africa. Many regions around the world face similar challenges. Additionally, not all African leaders or governments are corrupt. There are many African countries and leaders making strides in governance, transparency, and accountability, working hard to ensure that resources are used for the benefit of their people. It's also critical to recognize that while corruption plays a role, Africa's debt crisis is driven by a variety of factors, including global economic systems, historical inequalities, unfair trade practices, and external pressures. High interest rates on loans, volatility in global markets, and the legacy of colonialism have all contributed to the continent's financial struggles. To address these challenges, both African leaders and the international community need to work together. African leaders must prioritize good governance, transparency, and the responsible management of public resources. At the same time, the international system needs to provide more equitable financial structures, fair trade opportunities, and support for debt relief and restructuring. Only through collective efforts can we ensure that Africa's wealth is used to benefit its people, and that its debts are managed in a sustainable way. In short, while corruption is a factor, it's not the sole reason for Africa's debt issues. The solution lies in addressing both internal governance challenges and external systemic barriers.
Before I let you go, what message do you have for African leaders who may feel that the international system is stacked against them?
My message is one of solidarity and optimism. The international system does need reform, and I will continue advocating for Africa's rightful place in global governance. African nations should continue to push for these changes, and we at the United Nations are committed to supporting these efforts. The world needs a stronger, more united Africa, and I am confident that with the right support, Africa's time has come.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of today's conversation. We appreciate your time, Mr. Guterres, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Remember, Africa's progress is everyone's responsibility. Stay informed, stay engaged, and until next time on Global Conversations, thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel.